Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a thinker who really dared to ask the biggest questions about how we live together, how we communicate, how we build a truly just society, especially after the immense ruptures, of the 20th century. Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into the profound and really sweeping ideas of Jürgen Habermas. He's definitely one of the most influential social theorists of the post-Second World War era.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And Habermas offers us what's often called a grand theory. It's like this comprehensive philosophical architecture, right? Built from across different fields, sociology, philosophy, politics. He's not just like describing society. He's actively seeking to understand its deep-seated problems and, maybe more importantly, its potential for human flourishing. Our sources give us a pretty concise yet really rich introduction to his intricate thought. We'll be focusing particularly on his mature theories, the ones that emerged from the 1980s onwards.
Yeah, and our mission today is to sort of navigate his 5 interconnected research programs. It's a lot. From how we make sense of language, all the way to his compelling vision for politics and law. We'll explore how he tried to rescue critical thought from this deep pessimism that had set in, and what he truly believed it means to be a rational, free individual in our modern world. It's a journey into ideas that honestly still resonate powerfully today, hopefully offering us some surprising facts, maybe some aha moments about our own social realities.
Absolutely. We'll be tracing the evolution of his thinking, from his critical engagement with the Frankfurt School to his really unique proposals for resolving social conflicts and envisioning a truly democratic future. And we'll keep asking, what does this all mean for you, the individual navigating this complex world? And how do these big philosophical structures help us understand the forces shaping our communities, shaping your own experiences?
Okay, so to truly grasp Habermas, we first need to understand the intellectual landscape he emerged from, specifically the Frankfurt School. They were pioneers of critical theory, right? This reflective, self-aware approach that didn't just mirror facts, but actively aimed to transform society. How exactly did they think a theory could do that? Was it about sparking revolutions or something more subtle?
That's a great question. It really gets to the heart of what critical theory meant for them. You see, Horkheimer and Adorno, key figures there, they saw it as a tool to unmask what they called the positivist illusion. This illusion was the idea that theories, like in natural science, just reflect some independent realm of fixed, unalterable facts. They completely rejected that static picture. Instead, they saw knowledge and reality as, dynamic, a two-way street. It's almost like a constant conversation where how we think about the world actually shapes the world, and that shaped world, in turn, influences how we think. So critical theory wasn't just descriptive, it was inherently reflective, self-aware of its own social context, the interests it served. Horkheimer argued its goal was deeply practical, transformative even, to diagnose what was wrong with contemporary society, and by finding progressive tendencies within it, to help transform it for the better. So no, not necessarily about violent revolution, but a fundamental shift in understanding and action.
That makes a lot of sense. So this critical theory was meant to be a tool for understanding and transforming society. But their diagnosis, especially in their big work, Dialectic of Enlightenment, it led them somewhere pretty bleak. This is where things take a surprisingly dark turn, isn't it? They saw enlightenment, the very thing supposed to liberate us, as actually leading to imprisonment through instrumental rationality. That sounds like a huge paradox.
It truly is, and it raises this really important question. What is the very tool of liberation, rationality itself, particularly instrumental rationality, which is, simply calculating the most efficient means to a given end? What if that becomes the dominant way of thinking? Horkheimer and Adorno argued society risks becoming purely industrialized, bureaucratized. This process, meant to master external nature, ironically ended up extending to the domination of human beings. They saw a kind of vicious spiral where instrumental rationality became exclusive, total. It meant the very concepts people used to understand their world became scientific, calculating, functional. Their experience in the U.S., with consumer society, especially the industrialization of culture Hollywood, broadcasting led them to this idea of the culture industry. They saw it as this subtle manipulation technique, creating false reconciliation, making people believe society was rational and free when it was actually deeply irrational and an obstacle. Think of Hollywood B movies, right? Predictable happy endings, they call these ersatz satisfactions. Manipulating desires, stopping people from critically engaging with the social conditions that actually thwart real happiness. It all ended up in what they termed an aporia, basically a complete philosophical deadlock, a dead end, where enlightenment was both necessary for survival and impossible to attain because rationality itself was the source of the problem. This led to this deep pessimism about social change. It really blunted the critical edge of their theory.
Wow.
Yeah.
So Habermas looked at this aporia, this deadlock, and thought, hang on, there's a flaw here. He didn't ditch critical theory, but he wanted to rescue it. His early work, Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, was a direct response, wasn't it? What was he trying to achieve there?
Exactly. His structural transformation was what you could call a constructively critical response. He kept the interdisciplinary approach, history, sociology, literature, philosophy, and he used this method of immanent criticism, which means you don't critique something by bringing in outside values. Instead, you hold it accountable to its own stated ideals. It's like saying, hey, you're not living up to your own promises. Habermas did this with 18th and 19th century bourgeois society. He criticized it for not living up to its own proclaimed ideals of equality and openness. The central concept he explored was the bourgeois public sphere. He saw it emerging in 18th century Europe. A revolutionary space, really. It was made up of physical spaces, coffee houses, salons, and media, like a free press, literary journals, places where citizens engaged in free public discussion as equals. Participation was voluntary, autonomous. It led to this normative notion of public opinion that could genuinely check government legitimacy and foster a shared idea of the common good.
Okay, so this public sphere was an idea. But you also said, and he put it this way, it was an ideology. What's the difference there? And why is that crucial for his critical point?
All right. Ideology for Habermas, and he's echoing Adorno here, is socially necessary illusion. It means widespread false beliefs that actually prop up relations of domination. It's not just a mistake. It's a belief that's widely held and serves a social function, like making a changeable social institution seem natural or making the interests of a few look like the common interest of everyone. Now, the public sphere, as an idea, embodied fantastic ideals: openness, inclusiveness, equality, freedom. These were, beyond reproach, a utopia worth pursuing. But as an ideology, it was a socially necessary illusion. Because in reality, who got to participate? Mostly educated men of means. The vast majority poor people, uneducated people, almost all women were excluded. So the interests of this small privileged group were presented as the common interest of all humankind. Habermas's critical point, though, was that despite this practical exclusion, the principle of universal accessibility made it more than just an illusion. It contained this latent potential, an ideal that was, and still is, worth chasing.
That's fascinating. Can you think of a modern ideal in your own society that maybe in practice functions as an ideology, something that presents particular interests as universal? What comes to mind for you, the listener, when you consider that today?
That's a really powerful, reflective question. It really shows how these deep philosophical ideas aren't just abstract. They can illuminate our contemporary world, right? Nudging us to look beneath the surface of things presented as universally good.
Definitely. So what happened to this promising public sphere? The text mentions its decline and disintegration. What brought down this potential utopia in Habermas's view?
Well, the public sphere, which he thought should have deepened and broadened its critical function, instead fragmented. It declined. This was driven, he argued, by mass media getting swallowed up by giant capitalist corporations. Public opinion became a manipulated commodity. Newspapers, magazines, radio, TV, instead of promoting genuine public discussion, they became consumer items that actually stifled it. This certainly echoes Horkheimer and Adorno's analysis of the culture industry, right? Where monopoly capitalism and welfare state liberalism led to a diminution of human freedom, a hollowing out of democratic politics. But Habermas was, I think, much clearer and more positive than Adorno and Horkheimer about the path that should have been taken. He wasn't just diagnosing the problem. He wanted to identify the social and institutional conditions needed for autonomy, not just resistance. He saw a kind of flickering hope, maybe, that a revitalized public sphere might still be forthcoming, perhaps from existing public spheres within organizations like political parties, if the right conditions were met. The core insight here, I think, is that these spaces for open, rational debate are fragile. They need active protection from commercial and political manipulation.
Okay, so after exploring the public sphere, Habermas's intellectual journey didn't stop. He went even deeper, starting what many call his years of journeying. This led to his massive work, The Theory of Communicative Action. And during this time, he really engaged critically with Marxism. What did he find problematic about Marx's view of human liberation?
Habermas argued that Marx's focus on labor as the basic category of human realization was, well, too narrow. For Marx, freedom was mainly about emancipating productive forces. But Habermas drew this crucial distinction. Labor is a subject-object relationship. It's instrumental. It's about manipulating nature or objects to achieve some end. Human interactions, though, are fundamentally different. They're intersubjective, largely non-instrumental. They involve communication, mutual understanding. So he stressed the importance of studying the evolution of normative structures and moral consciousness. He saw this as a necessary complement, even a corrective, to Marxist thought, which he felt was too focused on modes of production. This gave him a much richer picture of human association and social life. And during this period, he also engaged critically with American pragmatism thinkers like James, Dewey, Mead, Peirce, and German hermeneutics, from Dilthey to Gadamer. These traditions shared the idea that philosophy has to stay connected to everyday life, make a real difference. Plus, Habermas developed a critique of technology and science. He argued different kinds of knowledge, theoretical, practical, critical, serve different human interests, respectively. Technical control, mutual understanding, and emancipation from illusion.
So, with all this intellectual retooling, what were the big problems of social theory he actually set out to solve in the theory of communicative action?
He aimed to tackle three really big interconnected problems. First, the problem of understanding meaning in the social sciences. This is fundamentally about how we interpret human actions. Thinkers like Dilthey argued that human sciences, Geisteswissenschaften, need a different method than natural sciences. Natural science explains things causally, from the outside, but human actions need understanding from the inside, considering the agent's subjective experience. Like, if someone's running, you don't know why, just from observation. Are they hurrying, fleeing, exercising? You need to interpret their actions in context. Habermas found modern approaches that reconstruct agents' practical reasoning to be flawed. He argued they wrongly assume humans are pre-individuated, pre-social bearers of needs and reduce public meaning to private individual reasons. He insists linguistic meaning isn't just about propositional truth conditions. It involves a public, intersubjective dimension rooted in shared understandings.
Okay, and the second problem. This sounds like he was grappling with why people often seem to act against their own interests. The really thorny problem of irrationality and ideology criticism.
Precisely. Social theorists, following Marx, often used ideologies to explain why oppressed groups might maintain systems that harm them. They attributed it to widespread false beliefs or irrationality. But there's a critical flaw here. If you just label things widespread error and irrationality too easily, the social world becomes unintelligible. And how does the critic avoid their own theory being just another ideology? Habermas' solution here was crucial. He reframed it completely. It's not necessarily that people are inherently irrational or just hold false beliefs. It's more that they are funneled by economic and administrative systems into certain patterns of instrumentally rational behavior.
So the system itself shapes the rational choice.
Exactly. So the powerful takeaway here is, when you see seemingly irrational behavior in society, Habermas prompts you to look beyond individual blame. Ask, what larger system is funneling this behavior? What structures make this the most rational option within a specific, often hidden set of constraints? It totally reframes how we diagnose social problems, shifts the focus from individual flaw to systemic influence. The solution isn't just replacing false beliefs with true ones. It's about identifying and altering the mechanisms within the social system that push agents to act against their true interests. These forces can lead to actions whose significance goes way beyond what individuals can fully grasp or take responsibility for.
That's a really insightful shift. Consider a social or economic phenomenon you find puzzling right now. Does Habermas's reframing from individual flaw to systemic channeling offer you, the listener, a new lens for understanding it?
It's a powerful thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
It moves us away from just judging individual choices towards a deeper look at the societal pressures and structures they operate within.
And finally, the age-old question. How is social order possible? Philosophers for centuries have wrestled with this. Hobbes, Durkheim. What's Habermas's unique contribution here?
Habermas offers a really novel reconfiguration. He pulls insights from various theories, but gives them a new twist. He argues that social order in modern secular societies rests primarily on communicative action and discourse. He moves away from Hobbes' reliance on fear of punishment, which struggles with the free rider problem, right? And from social contract theories, which he felt just assumed norms rather than explaining where they came from. While acknowledging Durkheim's collective moral consciousness and Parsons' theory of moral dispositions, Habermas centers his whole argument on language. When we use language to coordinate our actions, we implicitly make commitments. Commitments to justify our actions and words with good reasons. He calls these validity claims. These claims have both a moral status, they're universal, unavoidable, create obligations, and a rational status, because they're tied to good reasons. These validity claims provide the sort of invisible lines along which our interactions unfold. They guide us away from conflict and help form stable social order. And this happens without relying directly on punishment, or shared religious traditions, or even pre-existing moral values in the same way earlier theories did. It's a profound shift. It suggests that the very act of sincere communication builds and maintains the social fabric. Social order becomes an ongoing accomplishment of human interaction.
So it really all comes back to language and communication. Habermas talks about his linguistic turn, but also a pragmatic turn. What does pragmatic mean here? How does it challenge older philosophical ways of thinking?
Right. For Habermas, the linguistic turn is fundamentally a turn away from what he calls the philosophy of consciousness, that whole paradigm. Cartesian subjectivity of the mind is this private internal realm, metaphysical dualism, social atomism, the idea that individuals come before society. Habermas rejects all that. He emphasizes the intersubjective dimension of social reality instead. His pragmatic turn means focusing not just on what language says its propositional meaning, its truth conditions like in Snow is White, but on what it does. He's interested in its use in coordinating actions, establishing consensus. The linguist Carl Buehler, for instance, highlighted three functions: cognitive, representing the world; appeal, directing requests; and expressive, disclosing speaker experiences. Habermas argues that traditional truth-conditional semantics makes a descriptive fallacy. It focuses almost entirely on the cognitive function and ignores the crucial speaker-hearer relationship. What's really illuminating here, I think, is that for Habermas, understanding the meaning of a speech act means knowing what would make it acceptable, not just its truth conditions.
It's a huge shift from an objective view of meaning to an intersubjective one. It highlights how communication actively shapes our shared social world.
And central to this pragmatic meaning are these validity claims. You mentioned them earlier, the commitments we make. Can you unpack the three types? Truth, rightness, and truthfulness. Why are they so essential?
Absolutely. Any sincere speech act, whether you're asserting something, making a request, declaring something implicitly, makes these three claims. They are, as he says, necessary presuppositions of meaningful speech. They're essentially commitments to provide appropriate reasons if you're challenged. So first, the claim to truth. That's about the factual content. If I say the sky is blue, I'm implying I have good reasons and could convince you of its truth if needed. Habermas clarifies truth is claimed for both the content and the utterance itself. Second, the claim to rightness. This relates to the underlying norm of an utterance. If I say stealing is wrong, I'm implicitly claiming I could justify the norm, do not steal. Habermas sees moral statements like stealing is wrong as sort of shorthand for imperatives. So the claim to rightness is about justifying the norm being evoked, not just its truth. Rightness here means the norm is justified based on reasons relevant to morality. And finally, truthfulness. This is about the speaker's sincerity. Are they being genuine? Are they trying to deceive? These claims aren't optional. They're already understood to have been made.
And if you challenge one, you're demanding justification, which leads us straight into discourse.
How do these underlying validity claims function in your own daily conversations, even when you're not consciously thinking about them? What happens maybe when one of them is called into question by someone you're talking to?
Think about that for a moment, listener. It really shows how deeply embedded these assumptions are in our everyday interactions. Like, if someone says, that movie was terrible, they're making a claim to truth about the movie's qualities, rightness about their judgment of terrible, and truthfulness about their sincerity. If you question their truthfulness, are you just saying that because you didn't like the actor? It immediately changes the whole dynamic, doesn't it?
So when communication breaks down or a claim is challenged, we enter discourse. This isn't just a casual chat then, is it? It's a very specific, almost technical concept for Habermas, like a philosophical judo move you said earlier.
It is. Discourse is a reflective form of speech. Its aim is to reach a rationally motivated consensus. It's basically communication about communication. It gets initiated when a validity claim is rejected and the speaker is asked to back it up with reasons. It's not some rare, weird activity. It's the common practice of argument, justification, woven into everyday life. Habermas assumes it's the default way we resolve conflicts in modern societies. It repairs failed consensus, reestablishes the rational basis of social order. And since there are three types of validity claims, truth, rightness, truthfulness, there are three corresponding types of discourse: theoretical for facts, moral for norms, and aesthetic for expressions of taste. Discourse is also this highly disciplined practice. It's governed by what he calls idealizing pragmatic presuppositions, which we can think of as rules of discourse. These include basic logic rules like non-contradiction, procedural norms like sincerity and accountability. You have to say what you believe and be able to justify it. And crucially, rules to shield discourse from coercion, like every competent subject gets to participate. Everyone can question any assertion. Everyone can introduce any assertion. Everyone can express their attitudes, desires, needs, and nobody gets prevented from doing these things by coercion, whether internal or external.
These rules are necessary, and idealizing, they point us towards rational consensus.
And how does he justify these rules? You mentioned something called performative self-contradiction. Sounds like a clever philosophical move.
It really is. A performative self-contradiction happens when the act of saying something contradicts its content, like saying, "It's raining, but I don't believe it." The act of stating implies belief, which contradicts its content. Habermas argues that statements like, "We reached a rationally motivated consensus by excluding certain people from the discourse," well, they demonstrate that the rules of discourse are unavoidable presuppositions. To deny them is to contradict the very act of engaging in discourse itself. For instance, denying the right of equal participation while claiming you've reached rational consensus is inherently self-contradictory. The core insight is that the very act of engaging in reasoned argument implicitly commits us to certain norms of fairness and openness.
Okay, so if communication is the bedrock of understanding and social order, how does Habermas see society itself structured? He introduces this fundamental distinction almost like two operating systems, the life world and the system.
He does. Habermas sees modern societies as existing in this kind of fragile equilibrium between these two spheres. The life world is the informal, unmarketized domain. Think family, culture, voluntary organizations, political life, outside formal parties, or mass media. It's this rich storehouse of shared meanings, understandings. It functions as the background against which communicative action happens. You can think of it like a horizon. It marks the limit of our vision. It's unified, but not a closed totality, always open to gradual, piecemeal revision. Like Nuret's boat, right? You repair the planks while sailing. The life world provides the context for action, a stock of shared assumptions, background knowledge. It fosters social integration, critical reflection. Every successful communication, every consensus reached, feeds back into and replenishes the life world. It acts as a bulwark against social disintegration, supports cultural reproduction.
And then there's the system, which sounds less warm and fuzzy, more machine-like, maybe.
Indeed. The system comprises these sedimented structures of instrumental action. It's divided into two subsystems: money, the capitalist economy, and power, the state administration bureaucracy. These act as steering media. They impose external aims, patterns of instrumental behavior on people. Like, a company executive or employee is primarily guided by financial aims. The ultimate goals of these actions are often preset, not always obvious to the agents themselves. The system's main job is the material reproduction of society producing, circulating goods and services. It also provides system integration, coordinating actions in large, complex societies without relying on direct consensus. And this is a key difference from Adorno and Horkheimer. Habermas is not inherently hostile to instrumental rationality or the state and market. He sees they fulfill necessary social functions. You can't just abolish them. However, while life-world constraints are internal, self-imposed through recognizing validity claims, system constraints are external, non-negotiable. They can feel like a block of quasi-natural reality, kind of escaping human control.
So we have these two spheres, and the text describes this worrying phenomenon, the colonization of the life world. What happens when the system encroaches on the life world? What are these social pathologies that result?
What's really fascinating here is Habermas's argument for the priority of the life world. The system, he argues, is embedded in, its parasitic upon, the life world for its resources of meaning. But when the system's instrumental logic coordination by money and power expands unchecked into the life world, it replaces consensual coordination with these external steering mechanisms. This leads to serious social pathologies. Things like a decrease in shared meanings, what Durkheim called anomie, the erosion of social bonds, disintegration, feelings of helplessness, lack of belonging, alienation, and unwillingness to take responsibility, demoralization, and ultimately social instability. It represents this profound loss of meaning and autonomy. Individuals get forced into patterns of instrumental action where the true significance of their actions becomes opaque, exceeding their capacity to understand or take responsibility.
Wow, that sounds like a really powerful diagnosis of modern ills. Is Habermas's social theory just a critique then, or does it offer a path forward? What's the remedy for this colonization?
That raises a really important question. Habermas mainly offers critical theory as a diagnostic tool, not really a revolutionary prescription. He doesn't think theories directly cause revolutions. The implied answer, if his theory is right, is to protect the life world. How? By containing the systems of money and power. This means ensuring there are sufficient domains of unadministered, unmarketized social life, enough space to foster social integration and properly embed the systems of money and power within society. Interestingly, he sees this less as purely political, more as a social task. Similar to his early hopes for the public sphere, he's quite realistic, maybe even a bit pessimistic.
He acknowledges there's no single agent powerful enough to just halt or reverse colonization. The state, often part of the system itself, isn't the sole answer. His flickering optimism rests on the weak agency of new social movements and a democratic welfare state, influenced by moral beliefs and nonviolent protest. And while his critique seems functional on the surface, colonization messes up the Lifeworld's function. It carries this indelibly ethical tinge. Why? Because the Lifeworld's communicative practices inherently foster ideals of equality, solidarity, a kind of moralization. Systems, on the other hand, foster instrumental habits, indifference. So colonization doesn't just make society malfunction, it produces morally flawed individuals. And that's the real heart of the problem.
Okay, so Habermas views modernity not just as a historical period, but as an unfinished project. What does he mean by that? What are the stakes involved in completing it?
He sees modernity as this cultural movement that emerged to deal with problems unleashed by the Enlightenment, especially the challenge of reconnecting specialized knowledge science, morality, art, with everyday life. The project is unfinished because, well, these problems haven't been solved. Habermas rejects attempts to just reverse modernization. Things like anti-modernity, trying to regress to pre-modern life, like some rigid forms of communitarianism, or postmodernism, which he worried might discard fundamental humanitarian ideals along with what he saw as the problems of instrumental rationality. He sees those as worse alternatives, dead ends. Completing modernity for him means critically appropriating its possibilities, cultural, technological, economic, but doing it in the light of secular humanitarian ideals. It demands encouraging social modernization in non-capitalist directions, and crucially, preserving the life world from the system's corroding effects. Not an easy task, as we've said, but he believes it's the only viable path. For Habermas, modernity has to create its own norms, its own values out of itself, from communication and discourse, not just borrow them from the past or from external authorities.
And a key part of this project is how secular morality emerges from its Judeo-Christian roots. How does Habermas trace that evolution, and what's his critique of Kant, who he sees as the first really modern moral theorist?
He describes how questions of the good life, what makes a life fulfilling for me or us, gradually separated from questions of justice or moral rightness as modernity unfolded. Morality evolved from just a set of commands to a system of universal and unconditional principles. That's a legacy of Judeo-Christianity. These norms, like do not steal, survived modernization because they still serve that vital function, resolving conflicts, maintaining social order. Habermas praises Kant as the first modern moral theorist. Why? Because Kant located moral authority not in a list of specific rules, but in the formal criterion of universalization, the categorical imperative. Act only on that maxim by which you can at the same time will it to be a universal law. However, he criticizes Kant's monological procedure, the idea that each individual figures this out alone, doing a kind of moral mental arithmetic. For Habermas, morality is essentially social. It's a dialogical process of reaching consensus. He shifts the emphasis from what each can will without contradiction to be a general law to what all can will in agreement to be a universal norm. This requires collective justification, a shared public space for moral reasoning.
In your experience, listener, how often are moral dilemmas approached as individual mental arithmetic versus a collective discussion aimed at universal agreement? Take a moment to think about how this plays out in your own life.
It's a compelling contrast, isn't it? Our instinct often pulls towards the individual, that private deliberation. But Habermas really pushes us to consider the necessity, the power of the collective, of public deliberation for truly valid moral claims.
Which leads us right to his discourse ethics. This is really the normative heart of his whole philosophy, isn't it? What are its core principles? How does it propose we actually establish valid moral norms?
Exactly. Discourse ethics aims to figure out the conditions under which modern moral agents can successfully answer, what ought I to do? It sees moral discourse as this social mechanism for resolving conflict and replenishing shared norms. He identifies two key principles. First, the discourse principle, D. This is kind of a negative test. Only those action norms are valid to which all possibly affected persons could agree as participants in rational discourse. It's a weaker, simple conditional. It mainly tells you which norms are not valid if not everyone can agree, and sets a really high bar for rejection because all possibly affected persons can be incredibly broad, even including future generations. Then there's the stronger, more affirmative moral principle, U, or universalizability. This one says a norm is valid if and only if the foreseeable consequences and side effects of its general observance for the interest and value orientation of each individual can be freely and jointly accepted by all affected. This is a much stronger biconditional principle. It positively defines what moral validity is.
And notice, it builds a consequentialist element, considering foreseeable consequences for each individual into his otherwise deontological, duty-based theory. It demands equal consideration of all interests to find what he calls a universalizable interest. This process draws on George Herbert Mead's idea of ideal role-taking, adopting the perspective of the generalized other. It means each person has to actively modify their own interests by understanding and recognizing everyone else's, leading to a larger self, impartiality. Like when considering a social welfare policy, you have to genuinely adopt the perspective of both the wealthy and the poor, ensuring the norm could be freely accepted by all. This perspective-taking aims to weed out norms that just favor particular groups, establishing a shared common good.
But his discourse ethics definitely face challenges, especially around its justification and how it handles real-world complexity. The text mentions redundancy and circularity objections. What do these criticisms highlight about the limits, maybe?
Yeah, these criticisms really pinpoint the difficulties in grounding a universal morality this way. The redundancy objection points out that the moral principle is so demanding, requires such universal agreement, that very few norms would likely ever achieve validity, which seems to undermine morality's central role in keeping social order. Habermas initially pushed back, but later conceded this point. He argued that the few universal norms we can validate, like basic human rights, are nonetheless crucial, but it does raise questions about how practical morality is for resolving everyday conflicts if so few norms are truly valid. The circularity objection questions whether his justification for you is genuinely non-moral. Some of the rules of discourse themselves, like allowing everyone to express their needs, seem to have moral weight built in.
Like assuming equality from the start.
It's exactly. Granting everyone permission to express needs, while presented as a non-moral rule of discourse, looks like it implicitly contains moral assumptions about equal consideration. It potentially begs the question. These criticisms highlight the tension. He's trying to ground universal morality in both procedural rationality and real-world social practices. It's just incredibly difficult to abstract from the complexities of actual human experience while trying to justify moral principles on purely non-moral grounds.
Okay, so given these complexities, it's clear Habermas saw that moral discourse alone couldn't hold society together. He then takes what's called a political turn. He introduces distinctions between moral, ethical, and pragmatic discourse, focusing more on politics and law. How does he differentiate ethical discourse from moral discourse? And why is this important for a pluralistic society like ours?
Right. Ethical discourse shifts focus. It moves away from universal questions of right and wrong, which is moral discourse's territory, to more particular questions of good for me or good for us. It's teleological, meaning it's concerned with evaluating the choice of ends, the rational assessment of goals for an individual or a specific community. Pragmatic discourse, by contrast, is just about the rational choice of means to an already given end. Ethical discourse brings values to the forefront. Values are these basic symbolic parts of a culture, shaping our needs, desires, identities. Unlike absolute moral norms, ethical judgments only have relative or conditional validity. They're binding only on members of a specific group or cultural tradition. This distinction is absolutely crucial for modern multicultural societies. Why? Because it allows different cultural groups to clarify and critically reflect on their own traditions and values to see their collective identity as a project without having to claim universal moral truth for them. Think about that example of the immigrant daughter in arranged marriage. Ethical discourse helps clarify and maybe reinterpret the competing values, individual autonomy, romantic love, cultural tradition for everyone involved, fostering understanding within that specific context.
But even with ethical discourse allowing for these cultural differences, Habermas still insists on the priority of the moral over the ethical. What does that mean in practice?
It means that while ethical considerations are vital for self-understanding, both individual and group morality ultimately sets the boundaries. Valid moral norms, the ones embodying universalizable interests, trump any ethical values that conflict with them. So, for example, if a cultural practice, no matter how ethically justified within a specific group's traditions, violates a universal moral norm, like a fundamental human right, then the moral norm takes precedence. Habermas argues this priority is pragmatic. It avoids intractable conflict in a pluralistic world. It's social ontological. Moral norms are anchored in the basic communicative structure of the life world. And it's supported by modernization theory. Post-conventional subjects tend to embrace discursive procedures before tackling substantive ethical questions. And this is a really fascinating point where he both converges with and diverges from someone like John Rawls. Rawls, in his Political Liberalism, tried to frame justice principles as political, not metaphysical, like a practical agreement for stability. But Habermas pushes further. He insists moral rightness actually has a cognitive status. It's something we can, in principle, know to be objectively valid through rational discourse. It's not just something we agree on for political convenience.
Okay, so morality sets the bounds. How do politics and law then step in to help stabilize social order in these complex multicultural societies?
Habermas sees this two-track structure of politics. There's the informal civil society, and then the formal institutional sphere. Civil society is made up of voluntary organizations, political associations, the media. It's this network for spontaneous, informal communication, opinion formation. The formal institutional sphere includes parliaments, cabinets, political parties, the places designed for decision-making. A healthy political system then needs to be porous. It needs to be open to civil society's input, translating communicative power generated there into administrative power. This is crucial for creating legitimate, justifiable policies and laws that citizens will rationally comply with. Political justifications are broad. They include epistemic, moral, ethical, pragmatic reasons, plus fair compromise. It acknowledges legitimacy comes from a complex process. He also talks about a dual structure of law. A law needs to be both legitimate, have a point, good reason for obeying, and positive, properly enacted by authority, coercible. Validity requires both. The legitimacy part is key for getting voluntary rational compliance, especially in big societies where you can't coerce everyone all the time.
And this legitimacy for Habermas comes from the democratic principle, which is a specific version of the discourse principle. It requires laws to be agreeable to all members of the legal community through a legally constituted process that's open to civil society.
And how does this whole framework address that tension we so often see, the tension between individual human rights and the collective ideal of popular sovereignty?
He argues they are equiprimordial and reciprocal, meaning neither comes first, and they actually depend on each other. Liberal democracy often prioritizes individual autonomy, human rights, seeing them as pre-political, with the state needing to be neutral on values. Civic republicanism tends to emphasize collective self-rule, community values, seeing rights as coming from the community. Habermas rejects both extremes as inadequate for modern societies. He argues rights are acquired through socialization, community membership is intrinsically valuable, and political justifications should embrace ethical considerations about the good life. Modern popular sovereignty, for him, doesn't reside in some collective subject like the people. It resides in subjectless forms of communication and discourse, circulating through legislatures, influenced by civil society. So the system of rights protects civil society, and civil society in turn feeds legitimate law. It's a loop. This framework allows both individual freedom and collective self-determination to be realized together within the democratic legal order.
How do current political debates in your own country reflect this tension between individual rights and collective will? Does Habermas's idea of equiprimordial, of them being mutually dependent, suggest a different way forward for you, the listener?
It's a question that really cuts to the heart of so many contemporary political struggles, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Habermas offers this sophisticated lens to analyze these deep tensions, suggesting a path where maybe these two fundamental aspects of freedom aren't enemies, but actually mutually reinforcing.
Finally, Habermas extends these ideas to a post-national citizenship. He was a strong advocate for European integration and had this deep antipathy to nationalism. What did his own personal experience teach him about the dangers of nationalism?
Well, his personal experience growing up in Nazi Germany profoundly shaped his deep distrust of nationalism. He recognized that while the nation-state historically emerged to create solidarity among strangers in modern societies, the idea of an ethnic nation, a Volksgemeinschaft, is inherently dangerous. It's exclusionary by nature. It draws lines, us versus them, based on language or ancestry. It inevitably leads to the oppression of internal minorities. Furthermore, nationalistic ties are prediscursive. They're emotional, not based on reason, and easily manipulated by political elites to quiet dissent or rally support for foreign adventures. He saw this fundamental tension between the universalism of an egalitarian legal community, Rechtsgemeinschaft, and the particularism of a community united by historical destiny. His criticisms of German unification back in 1989 really highlight this. He was critical of the quick adoption of Article 23 over Article 146 in the Basic Law. He argued it created a normative deficit by skipping an ethical political discourse about their shared future. This, he felt, led to an administrative liquidation of East German civil society and risked economic nationalism and racist violence, like the terrible events in Rostock and Hoyerswerda. He saw nationalism as fundamentally regressive, an attempt to reverse modernization, replacing legitimate law with these non-rational, effective ties.
So instead, he champions constitutional patriotism. What exactly is that? And why does he see it as the only appropriate form of identification in modern times?
Constitutional patriotism basically means identifying primarily with democratic procedures and universal moral principles, rather than with a specific ethnic nation or cultural tradition. It allows for a more decentered and abstract identity, one that recognizes the equal worth of others. It shifts allegiance from pre-political ties of blood or soil to open political criteria of membership in a shared legal community. For Habermas, nationalism is just this regressive attempt to undo modernization, replacing communication and legitimate law with emotional, non-rational bonds. In our multicultural, globalized world, he argues, constitutional patriotism is the only viable path forward. It's how we forge post-national social integration based on a shared political culture and discourse, even across borders. This connects directly to his views on European integration. He saw it as a necessary response to globalization, where individual nation-states just can't contain the negative effects of global markets anymore. The goal is to create supranational political institutions capable of reigning in the economy, ultimately pointing towards a kind of cosmopolitan world politics. A global order where shared principles, not shared ancestry, define our allegiance.
And while he absolutely acknowledged the democratic deficit in places like the EU, he still maintained this flickering optimism for the future of democratic politics. So what's the final provocative thought he leaves us with from this massive project?
He concedes, look, there's no European people in the traditional ethnic sense, but he denies that's necessary for social integration anymore. Modern societies are lawful communities of citizens, and this thin conception of democratic citizenship can stretch across borders, mediated by law. The democratic deficit in the EU, that gap between administrations and democratic processes, he believed it can be filled by encouraging a Europe-wide civil society, a shared political culture, maybe even Europe-wide political parties through things like educational exchange, economic cooperation. The provocative thought he leaves us with is really this. While we don't know if we will succeed in building these post-national democratic structures, we must keep trying. As he puts it, because we don't know, we still have to try. Because the alternative, just giving up on the idea of democratic politics as the collective shaping of our social world by free and equal citizens, that alternative is unequivocally worse. It's called a persistent critical engagement with the unfinished project of an enlightened rational society, recognizing that our collective freedom is an ongoing, vital task, never finished.
Here's where it gets really interesting, doesn't it? Habermas presents us with this deeply interconnected system where the way we understand meaning, the way we communicate, directly impacts everything: social order, democratic legitimacy, even our global future. It's such a powerful reminder that the everyday act of talking, of trying to understand each other, it carries immense philosophical weight, huge political potential. So what does this all mean for you, the listener, in your daily life?
Well, this raises a really important question for all of us, doesn't it? If the very fabric of our society depends on the integrity of our life world, on the quality of our communication, how vigilant are we in protecting those spaces, protecting them from the colonizing forces of instrumental rationality? Habermas challenges us to see our roles not just as individuals, but as active participants in this ongoing collective project, a project to make our shared world more rational, more just, and truly free. Maybe consider how your own daily acts of communication, how you talk, how you listen, how you argue, contribute to, or maybe sometimes detract from this grand project.
That's a truly powerful thought to chew on. This deep dive into Jürgen Habermas's philosophy really shows us that the biggest questions about society, morality, politics, they're often found right there in the most fundamental aspects of how we interact as humans. It's just such a rich tapestry of ideas. It continually pushes us to reflect on the world we inhabit, and perhaps more importantly, the world we aspire to build together.
And remember, his work isn't just theoretical gymnastics. It's a call to action, in a way. A call to recognize the normative ideals already embedded in how we communicate, and to critically engage with the ongoing processes of modernization. The unfinished project of modernity is, in essence, our collective task, always evolving, always demanding our participation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us on this pretty profound journey into Habermas's thought. We really hope it sparks further curiosity for you and maybe even inspires you to contribute to that unfinished project yourself.